Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video we'll be talking about CGP Gray's Rules for Rulers and linking it back to our bigger story about technological change. So, in the video, CGP laid out a sort of plain English basic argument for how the power structure of a nation affects its income distribution and its political system. Rulers, even the most dictatorial, ultimately depend on the loyalty of their own subordinates in order to put their plans into action. And rulers, even dictatorial ones, are ultimately competitors in a market for political power. The fact that they are who they are based on the loyalty of their supporters means that they have to jockey with their rivals, offering a better deal to their supporters. And so ultimately, how good a nation is to live in is going to depend on how many people are necessary to take power. And this refers both to formal institutions through which people express support, such as an election versus a hereditary monarch versus some kind of one party state, and it refers to more basic economic power. Who controls resources? Who owns resources? Who runs the businesses? You end up with a theory that predicts that democracies are going to yield better outcomes, not because democracies tend to put wiser rulers in power, but because those rulers have to give their people a better deal just in order to keep their position. And you likewise get an argument for why dictatorships tend to be self-perpetuating. Even if the people overthrow a dictator, the dictator will often be replaced with a new dictator because the dictatorship spawns naturally out of the material conditions of that society. If the keys to power haven't changed, or if you've merely rotated who holds the key, then you still have a political system that incentivizes the formation of some kind of authoritarian state. But what CGP Grey did not get into is the way this affects long-term growth. We can use this theory, which was originally developed by the political economist Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. We can use this theory to explain inequality within a country. We can use this theory to explain the violent and cyclical nature of revolutions. But how can we use this to explain the failure of a place to develop cutting edge growth? Why do some countries seem to only catch up, but never push the technological boundary? And the key to this is that the rulers of society usually have some control over technological growth, and they usually don't like it. And this is where we're going to move over to start talking about Joseph Schumpeter. Now, Schumpeter was another one of these Austrian school economists, just like Friedrich Hayek. And also like Friedrich Hayek, he ended up having some mainstream contributions. In particular, an idea called creative destruction. Now, Schumpeter is writing in the mid-1900s. His book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, comes out in 1942. And what makes Schumpeter notable is that whereas classical economists prioritized equilibrium concepts, stagnant situations, Schumpeter is fascinated by change. In fact, Schumpeter actually has a lot in common with Karl Marx, despite them coming from exact opposite ends of the political spectrum. Marx had this evolutionary concept of society. He sees society as being driven by this Hegelian dialectic, where modes of production, economic systems, create their own internal conflicts, which then resolve themselves to create entirely new systems. And Schumpeter sees the world in much the same way, but he also recognizes that there is this internal dynamism within capitalist society itself. See, Schumpeter, again, lives in the mid 1900s. Most of our classical economics was developed during or really right before the Industrial Revolution. It was developed in a time when market economies were just beginning to create the modern world, but they're still in that sort of slow phase of that rocket-like takeoff. Men like Adam Smith or Thomas Malthus from your Worldly Philosophers book, or even Karl Marx, could recognize that there was change in the world. The world was moving faster than it used to, but they simply couldn't conceive of just how much it would change. For example, I had a great grandma, we called her Little Granny, who lived in 3 centuries. She was born in 1899 and she died in 2000, which I think has to be a very small club of people. And in her own lifetime, Little Granny went from a world where almost everybody is driving cars to where cars are starting to drive themselves. She went from a world where there was no powered lighter than air flight, no airplanes, to a world where men were landing on the moon. She went from a world where something like a telephone was a great novelty to a world where everyone is constantly connected to the internet. And she also lived through a period of massive social change, too. Little Granny was a teenager, like 15 when World War I breaks out. She was an adult woman with her own family during World War II. She lives through the entirety of the Cold War. She lives through the entirety of the civil rights movement, of the sexual revolution. She lives to see a whole familiar world die and then a whole new one be created, all in one lifetime. And at the start of it, nobody knew that that was going to happen. Well, unlike these earlier economists, Schumpeter is right in the middle of it. And Schumpeter also happens to live in an era that's just really beginning to embrace evolution in the biological sense as well, with the spread of Darwinism, its acceptance into academia. So for Schumpeter, it's very natural to think of the world not in terms of stability, not in terms of some sort of self-sorting pattern where everything finds its own level, everything finds its own place, and it all fits into this grand celestial clockwork, like someone like Smith sees it. Instead, he sees it as endless churn, but it's still not chaos. There is still order in the churn, order in the chaos. It's only chaotic to the individual perspective. And in particular, what he's going to focus on is technology. See, whereas Marx puts exploitation at the center of his story, Schumpeter is going to put technology at the center of his story. And it occurred to me, I didn't think to include this in the slides. You know, every single semester, I'm always making tweaks. Usually I'm adding more stuff than I can fit into time. But you have different types of growth. I already talked about catching up and cutting edge. Well, some of the types of growth we could identify are, for example, Adam Smith talked about what we now call Smithian growth, where you have the division of labor and expansion of markets. In Smith's world, as more people get tied into markets and as more people specialize in certain kinds of production, you can get more and more production per person. And that's more or less how Europe is growing up until the Industrial Revolution. That's what kind of helps them start to take off as the rest of the world's stagnating. And then you get this transition into what Solow calls catching up, but which you might also call capital accumulation or Marxist growth, where it's all about, building up stocks of capital. And I think there might be some another type. It's just slipping my head at the moment. But what's different from Schumpeterian growth and both Smithian and Marxist growth is that it has no theoretical limit, because Schumpeterian growth is going to be based around technological change, based around this concept that we can find entirely new ways to produce things, and not just new, and entirely new products to produce, and not just different ways to organize labor. Because if all you can do is just make tweaks to your system to fine tune it or accumulate machines, you eventually come up with the best possible system. But in Schumpeter's world, there is no best system because the possibilities themselves constantly move. And most importantly, in Schumpeter's view, technology is primarily being driven by the entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are locked in a battle to the death with each other for control of a limited market. Entrepreneurs have to deal with this tendency of the rate of profit to fall, just like they do in Marx's model. They have an issue. As long as there's free entry, people are going to enter, yet they're going to drive the price and thus the profits down. And eventually, this is going to put great stresses on each individual producer as they're just barely able to operate their business. Now, in Marx's world, which again is incorrect, the way they get out of this is by exploiting workers even more. And there are scenarios where in a not purely capitalist system, this can be true, right? Times when they conspire, often with the help of the government, to limit people's wages, to limit people's ability to unionize, and so on and so forth. But with Schumpeter, the way he sees it is entrepreneurs have the ability to develop a new product, which they then have a monopoly over for at least as long as it takes other people to enter the market, to learn how to copy them. And then this creates a new market, and the process of entry begins all over again. In Schumpeter's world, the profits are falling and falling and falling until you get new invention, new markets, new products to sell, and then the possibilities for profit shoot back up. And the process is both creative and destructive. See, Schumpeter has an interest in Hinduism, and he likes to draw metaphors from Hinduism, just like Oppenheimer does. You know, now I am become death, destroyer of worlds. Well, Schumpeter is going to be inspired by that same god, Shiva. Shiva is the Hindu god of creation and of destruction. There's this contradiction inside of Shiva, and yet the two parts in reality go hand in hand, even though they look like very different things. Life and death, two sides of the same coin. Well, likewise, technological change creates and destroys. It kills off old businesses, but it creates new industries that replace them. Let's think, what happens when a new technology comes along? Well, and specifically, let's focus on changes in production for the moment. We'll talk about a new technology for producing goods as opposed to a new type of consumer good. Well, if you have a new type of capital that's more efficient, that can get more output from the same amount of labor, or equivalently, that can take less labor to make the same amount of output, or that can even conserve on other resources, then this is going to mean that factor demand will fall in that given industry. we don't need as many workers. And so those people get laid off. Now, supply in that industry rises, output rises in that industry that has become a little bit more automated, a little bit more mechanized, but it also drives up unemployment. But at the same time, that frees up these workers and it frees up these other resources to make other things. The demand for labor in one industry falls, but the supply of labor to other industries rises as these unemployed workers have to find new work. And so they end up being employed in other businesses. And you might expect this to drive down the wage. And in the short term, it does. But if the supply of the now more mechanized industry goes up, that also reduces the price of their wares. And this means that consumers have more income to buy other things. I believe I've talked about this in the past, but when you're talking about all other goods as a bundle, like the bundle we use to measure inflation compared to one good, they tend to actually be complementary to each other. If one thing becomes cheaper, well, you're going to spend that money on other stuff. And so all other industries are going to grow. Not only will they be able, essentially, their demand shoots up. And so wages will also rise as well. The effect is that other sectors grow, and so the economy gets larger. Unemployment occurs, people lose their jobs, but these people ultimately adjust because the rest of the economy grows and provides new opportunities for employment. And you even get a little bit of Jevons paradox-like rebound as well. I believe it would be impossible to get an actual Jevons paradox with labor, but you do get rebound in the sense that if I'm expanding my business because I can produce more cheaply, I will need some more workers just to create that extra output, even if I don't hire more workers than I fired. So, just like how business cycles ultimately resolve themselves, just like how supply and demand shocks ultimately resolve themselves, the unemployment caused by technological change also ultimately resolves itself. The labor will find new employment, and as production as a whole increases, wages will rise to what they used to be. But this doesn't make everyone happy because, like with the business cycle, it hurts people in the short run. In the long run, everyone's fine, but in the long run, we're all dead. And you're going to run into opposition both from the bottom and the top. See, from the bottom, you often get what's called Luddites. Now, if you've heard this word Luddite before, it's pretty common, but some of you may not have. You probably know it as an insult for people who are afraid of technology, usually old people. It refers to this tendency, universal, it crosses all cultures, it even crosses all ages as well, although old people do show it more, a tendency to fear any kind of change, a tendency to have these knee-jerk reactions that when some new invention is introduced, that it is somehow going to result in more harm than good. And that's how we use the word now. But it originally described workers who were resisting technological change because they were afraid of the unemployment it would cause. See, back in Napoleonic Britain, right? They're fighting the Napoleonic Wars, which are like the world wars of their own day. Britain is under embargo from continental Europe. Britain has high taxes. Britain is struggling to maintain a food supply. And Britain has this large proletariat. They're the only European country besides Belgium that really has one at this time. And these people are suffering badly. They are getting ground down by the rising prices that come from their country being choked off by the war. And you add to this another problem. It's the Industrial Revolution. There's constantly new inventions being implemented, new tweaks being made to machines to save more labor. Now, in the long term, this is going to provide more employment to people than before. But in the short term, when they implement a new machine, but the rest of the market hasn't caught up yet, it results in people being laid off. First, it results in the artisans and craftsmen being ground down. People who are still working in their own shops, like people used to, who have not been run out of the market completely yet, but they're struggling to stay alive. In order to compete, in order to be able to offer their wares, that they have to lower the price. That lowers their own income. They're barely scraping by, and some of them are starting to fold. The factories are winning out. They just can't compete anymore. They can't support themselves on the amount of goods that they're able to make. Especially you talk about weavers this way, as it's mostly the textile industry that has this problem. And then you also have unemployment within the factory itself. People who were themselves the beneficiaries of these craftsmen being run out of business, but who are now finding themselves out of work as their own jobs are automated within the factory. I'm abusing the word automated a little. It's not like true automation like a button factory. There is someone at the machine, but the machine's, running way, way, way faster than the individual would. So these people start to organize, mostly in secret, and they start to fight back. They'll barge into factories, trash machines, set fire to factories. They'll attack wagons, bringing supplies. And everywhere they strike with these acts of vandalism, they leave a calling card. They write graffiti on the walls saying things like, General Ned Ludd was here. Now, General Ned Ludd isn't a real person. He's like Sergeant Kilroy from World War II or Anonymous from the early 2000s internet. Ludd is a folk character. He's a folk hero. He's like John Q. Public. His name serves as a representation for working men everywhere. But this industrial terrorism, this populist revolt against the industrialists, ends up being called Luddism. And the people that practice it are Luddites. And in time, that term will begin to change in meaning. Eventually, it comes to refer to anyone who's opposed to technological change for any reason. Now, this sort of Luddite philosophy doesn't go away. Over time, people came to understand that industrialization-induced unemployment was not permanent. As we got used to living into a capitalist society, the average person also came to be more accepting of this sort of change. But you still see it every now and then. You see it with concerns about things like, for example, the self-checkout counters in Walmart. And you can always count on people to politically organize in opposition to this. So very often, you will get Luddite resistance to new production, attempts to regulate the use of new technology in order to maintain existing employment levels and maintain the existing wage. Now that's from the bottom, and most people can get that idea. Everyone knows a story of someone who lost their job to automation. Although admittedly, it was a bigger deal back in like the 80s and 90s. But you also see a sort of twisted, warped version of Luddism from the top as well. And why? Why would business elites want to oppose technological change? Surely they're the ones who are benefiting from this. They're not losing their jobs. Well, the answer is that the elite are usually the elite because they won the game. They're the best at what they do. And so if the rules of the game change, they're often going to be screwed over. You don't see elites mobilizing against labor-saving or resource-saving technologies that they can use. They tend to like that kind of technological change. But what they fear is new production technologies that they don't control, and they fear new products that they don't sell. They fear it because creative destruction cannibalizes their own profits. If a new entrant comes into a market with a new invention, a new type of machine, a new good to sell, that's going to draw more business, more market share towards the entrant and away from them. And although the technology will eventually circulate, it may take so long to circulate that it's not worth sharing the market. And in the most dramatic cases, you can even see large businesses, even entire industries, going extinct due to the destruction side of creative destruction. Now, most of these are horrible cliches. I feel like a hack using them. But, for example, there used to be a thriving horse and mule industry in America. Well, horses and mules still exist. There are still ranches that produce them, but it's nothing like it once was. Do you think that if you were a horse rancher, that you would be happy about the spread of the automobile? There used to be a thriving railroad industry in the United States until the automobile came along. There used to be a little industry for producing devices that play music, radios, CD players, the Walkman, the iPod. How many people own any of those things now? How many of you have actually gone out and bought a radio set in your whole life? How many of you have bought CDs within the past couple of years? And these different products were made in very competitive markets. There were lots of different manufacturers of them, and yet they were all swept aside by one big entrepreneur, Steve Jobs, with the iPhone, with one of the first mass market, massively successful smartphones. You know, I can actually remember a time when smartphones existed, but they weren't common. You know, you had things like Blackberries before you had the iPhone, but smartphones were always thought of as being like a businessman's tool. You know, it was something that you had for a reason. Before then, they even had phones built into cars. Very expensive, too. And then over the course of my childhood, I saw that gradually, they begin to spread a little more. Parents start giving their kids flip phones. And usually you couldn't get on the internet. And if you could, the internet sucked and you had to get it off Wi-Fi. It was terrible. Yeah, I had an iPod as a kid. They don't even sell them anymore. I've tried to look. Now, in that case, the iPod ended up getting replaced by a product from the same company. But that wasn't true of the CD players. Apple didn't make CD players. It wasn't true of the Walkman. They didn't make that. They didn't make the phonograph. And smartphones alone played the role of Shiva to many different kinds of products. And one of the most shocking stories of elites embracing Luddism comes from the electrical industry, comes from a period in American history called the Battle of the Currents, when Thomas Alva Edison and Nikola Tesla went head to head over the future of how we would produce and transmit electrical power. See, the issue was that Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, was the incumbent. Edison was one of the great pioneers of the modern day R&D lab. He was not really much of a scientist himself. He was mostly good at taking credit for the things other people did, but he was the man who would organize, manage, and bankroll operations. He was the guy who got the eggheads together in one room and directed them on projects. He was a very productive entrepreneur at doing that. And Edison had played a huge role in spreading direct current power. He's getting the lights turned on for the first time in cities all across America. But there's problems with direct current power. It can't be transmitted very far, and so you essentially have to have a power plant on every block that you intend to service. And this in turn means that you also can't reap the benefits of large economies of scale. Electricity stays expensive. Now, along comes Nikola Tesla, a Serbian immigrant. And Tesla had done some work for Edison in the past, got cheated out of his wages. But Tesla teams up with one of Edison's big rivals, a man named George Westinghouse, and he had a new invention, what was called alternating current. A way of transmitting electrical current where you could use transformers to step up or step down the voltage, and so you could kind of top it off as it gets carried along the wires, and thus you could carry it a very long distance. With Tesla's new invention, with his new breakthroughs in electrical science, you didn't have to have a power plant on every street corner anymore. You could have one power plant that can service the whole city. You could create entire electrical grids spread out over states. And this also means that you can have massive economies of scale, especially when you start to tap the potential of things like hydroelectric power. You build turbines into waterfalls so that the waterfall spins the turbine and makes, huge amounts of power without even having to burn fossil fuels. So Tesla poses this mortal threat to Edison's business. And how do you think Edison responds to it? Well, the way Edison responds is he decides to run a smear campaign. He starts spreading rumors about how extremely dangerous AC power is. He does demonstrations where he'll take some like crazy high voltage and he'll pretend that it's just a normal amount of electricity, and he'll burn things, he'll shock people with it. And in one particularly infamous incident, they actually electrocute an elephant to death. There was this elephant that had killed its handler, circus elephant, and Edison hooks it up to electricity, fries the thing alive in front of an audience of people. And he's like, Look at the power of what one light bulb of Tesla's AC can do. Now, in the end, Edison loses. AC's potential spoke for itself. And in the end, if you try to lie, people will find out the truth sooner or later. But this is the kind of thing that established elites will do. Oftentimes, you will get manufacturers opposing a new product because it competes with their product, or opposing a new production technique because they don't have the means to implement it, at least in a timely manner. And so they don't want anybody being able to use it. It's the same problem as with patents, like the copyright trolls we talked about. But elites do not want to compete. And so when creative destruction threatens to steal their business, they're often going to react by trying to politically organize, pander to the public's ignorance, and get things shut down. Just get this invention banned or overly regulated to where it can't threaten us. And this is where institutions start to come in. But we'll pick up with that in the next one.